Hi, I'm the Saturn Scholar, and today we're going to be talking about the Sega Saturn, the best console of all time. Sega Saturn is a 32-bit 5th generation console that was released on November 22nd, 1994 in Japan, May 11th, 1995 in North America, and July 8th, 1995 in Europe. The 5th generation of consoles consists of the Sony PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Panasonic 3DO, Atari Jaguar, Amiga CD32, NEC's PCFX, and the Sega 32X. But the major three were the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and, of course, the Saturn. The Sega Saturn sold 9.4 million units worldwide. In Japan, it sold more than 6 million, but it only sold 2 million in the United States. The Saturn was discontinued on August 10, 1998 in most countries, and was discontinued in Japan in 2000. It has two controller ports in the front, and it outputs in composite video, but can also output in RF, S-video, RGB, and even EDTV/high vision, which is equality between standard and high definition. The Saturn had some serious power under the hood. It has 2 CPUs and 6 other various processors. This design of the hardware, however, made it very difficult for developers to create software using conventional programming. The main issue lied in the dual CPU architecture because both of the processors shared the same bus, a subsystem that transfers data between two components. So, both CPUs could not be accessed at the same time, severely limiting the output capacity of the Saturn. Even if programmers wanted to port games to the Saturn, they would have to jump through some major hoops. For example, Lobotomy Software had to entirely rewrite the build engine, an FPS engine created by Ken Silverman for 3D Realms, in order to port games such as Duke Nukem 3D and Power Slave. But some developers, such as Kenji Eno of Warp, creator of D and Enemy Zero, contested that the Saturn's shortcomings in these respects are overstated at best. Third-party development was initially hindered by the lack of useful development tools, meaning they had to write an assembly language, which is a low-level programming language in which each statement corresponds to a single machine code. Eventually, Sega responded to the criticism by writing new graphic libraries, which were claimed to make development easier and were presented as a new operating system by Sega of Japan. The way the Sega Saturn rendered its visuals was very different from the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. The PlayStation and Nintendo 64 rendered triangles as basic geometric primitive, as where the Saturn rendered quadrilaterals, which is similar to the way the Panasonic 3DO rendered. This proved to be a hindrance because most of the industry's standard design tools were based on triangles, making the Saturn have further issues in the way of developing for it. One of the challenges brought forth by the quadrilateral-based rendering was the problems with textured surfaces containing triangles. In order to make a triangular-shaped object, rendering had a fourth side with a length of 0. This technique proved problematic as it caused texture distortion and required careful reworking to achieve the desired appearance. Sega provided tools for remapping textures in UV space into rectangular tiles. These complications can be seen in the Saturn version of Tomb Raider, in which the triangular rocks are not as rendered as well as other systems' versions of the game. If used correctly, however, the quadrilateral rendering of the Saturn had its advantages. The Sega Saturn's quadrilaterals could sometimes better approximate perspective when compared to the PlayStation triangles, as demonstrated by several cross-platform titles such as Wipeout and Destruction Derby. The quadrilateral-focused hardware and a 50% greater amount of video memory also gave the Sega Saturn an advantage for 2D engines and attracted many developers of role-playing video games, arcade games, and traditional 2D fighting games. With creative programming, later games like Burning Rangers were able to achieve true transparency effects on hardware that used simple polygon stipples as a replacement for transparency effects in the past. The Saturn also had a cartridge slot on the top, giving potential for adding extra RAM or storage devices for saving games to the system. So, how did the Sega Saturn perform in the North American marketplace? Well, by the end of 1994, the 16-bit video game era was in twilight in North America, and gamers were eagerly anticipating the new 32-bit machines from Japan. In early 1995, Sega of America President Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn would launch in the US on Saturday, September 2, 1995. This date was greatly anticipated by gamers and the media alike. It also allowed Sony to announce that the PlayStation release date would be 1 week later on September 9, 1995. However, on May 11, 1995, at the first E3, Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn Day date was just a ruse, and that the system was being released nationwide by 4 select retailers: Toys R Us, Babbage's, Software Etc., and Electronics Boutique. Immediately, it appeared that Sega had a real opportunity to take a commanding 4-month lead in the 32-bit race by beating the PlayStation to the market. This surprise launch totally backfired on Sega for several reasons. The Saturn was released at a high price point of $399, while Sony announced a $299 price point for the PlayStation at E3 itself. The early launch also meant that the Saturn only had 6 games available at launch, as most third-party games were slated to be completed and rolled out around the original September 2nd launch date, and as many successful Japanese titles were not imported. Third-party publishers, particularly those based in North America, were angered as the surprise launch prevented them from capitalizing on the momentum inherent in the anticipated and planned release. Essentially, the only software available on the shelves at launch were software released by Sega itself. Many within the gaming industry view the early launch as a calculated move to give Sega larger sales of the Saturn software at the expense of independent developers. And if that weren't bad enough for Sega, the retailers who were not included in the early launch, most notably Walmart and KB Toys, felt totally betrayed, with some retaliating by supporting Sega's rivals. This resulted in Sega having difficulties with these distributors for the Saturn, and also for its successor, the Dreamcast. For example, Sega's action angered KB Toys so much that they refused to release the Saturn at all, and actually went as far as to have some of their retailers remove anything Sega related in their stores to provide more retail space for the Sega Saturn's competition instead. By the time of the PlayStation's release on September 9, 1995, the Saturn had approximately sold 80,000 systems. The PlayStation, on the other hand, managed to sell over 100,000 units in its first weekend of availability in the US. From 1995 to 1997, Saturn became the other system, running a distant third between the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. However, it was the preferred system for many arcade and import gamers. Sales of the Saturn would generally spike as new arcade ports were released, but then die off shortly after. By the end of 1997, Sega has announced that it would develop a successor, the Dreamcast, causing console sales and game releases to drop dramatically. The Saturn's commercial failure in North America caused Sega to lose, catch this, $267.9 million and lay off 30% of its workforce. Well, how about Japan? The Japanese Saturn was released in November 1994, just 6 weeks ahead of its rival, the Sony PlayStation. Approximately 170,000 machines were sold the first day the console went on sale. And in a special Game Machine Cross review in May 1995, Famicom Tushishin would score the Sega Saturn console a 24 out of 40. Many of the games that made the Saturn popular in Japan, such as Sakura Taisen series and various role-playing video games, were never released in foreign territories, as it was assumed that Sega America and Sega of Europe that they were not appealing to the Western audiences. The last commercial license was released in Japan, and the last official game for the system was Yakuyu Genseokyo Hozaban Perpetual Collection, released by MediaWorks on December 4, 2000. As price drops continued for the Saturn throughout the 32-bit era, the system board design of the Saturn was not as easy to condense in a cost-saving manner, and Sega fell behind after the price drops offered by Nintendo and Sony. As a marketing strategy, however, Sega bundled 3 of its best-selling games, Daytona USA, Virtual Cop, and Virtual Fighter 2, with the system in order to keep the more expensive Saturn competitive with its rivals. This gave the console a small boost in sales, but it wasn't quite enough to cause any significant impact in the console race. By early 1997, the Saturn was trailing the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation in both North America and Europe, to such an extent that the senior management began planning a new platform, and by E3 in 1997 had begun talk of the system called the Katana, which would later be named the Dreamcast. The Sega of America president Bernie Stoller, who was strongly in favor of the upcoming console, announced, "The Saturn is not our, Sega's, future." As Sega began public discussion about their next generation system, barely 2 years after having launched for the Saturn, it became a self-defeating prophecy. This move, combined with Sega's recent history of short-lived consoles, particularly the Sega CD and 32X, which were considered ill-conceived and completely turned off gamers and developers alike, which led to a chain reaction that quickly caused the Saturn's future to collapse. Immediately following this announcement, sales of the console and software substantially tapered off in the second half of 1997, and many planned games were cancelled, causing the console's life expectancy to shorten substantially. While this let Sega focus on bringing out its successor, The premature demise of the Saturn caused them financial problems. Even though the Dreamcast did address many of the problems of the Saturn, Sega's damaged reputation caused customers and publishers to be skeptical and hold out to see how it would fare against the Sony's PlayStation 2. The aggressive move to replace the Saturn resulted in a rift between Sega and many of their third-party developers and publishers. North American developers were already hostile to the Saturn because it was difficult to program for, and because they were left out by its early release, so the future project alienated what remaining support Sega had in that region. However, many Japanese developers had strongly supported the Saturn in its homeland and saw little reason for Sega to rush another platform to the market. The early abandonment of the Saturn hurt third-party software support not only for that system, but also for Sega in general. Several major publishers such as Electronic Arts declined to support the upcoming Dreamcast, which played a part in its discontinuation as well. Several games intended for release in North America or Europe were cancelled. These titles included Sonic Extreme, Policenauts, and Lunar Silver Star Story, the latter two remaining as Japanese market exclusives. Further cancellations in 1998 followed, cutting the Western release list down to titles such as Steep Slope Sliders, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Burning Rangers, The House of the Dead, Shining Force 3, and Magic Knight Rayearth. The Saturn was discontinued in 1998 in most countries, and 2000 in Japan.
Now I know what you're thinking. Sega Saturn came and went. It died pretty quickly and can't have a lot of good titles on it. But I'm going to prove you wrong. In later episodes I'll go over the great games, the horrible games, and the so-so games. There's arcade ports, racing games, shooting games, fighting games, every game you can think of. The Sega Saturn, if anything, has a lot of variety. So, be sure to stay tuned for more episodes. And remember, to learn is to live.